AI is fantastic, but if you have bad or overexposed information, AI is going to surface it. AI is not going to care that it shouldn't show you something. You have access to it. It's going to show it to you. So getting permissions right, getting the memberships right, getting identities right is absolutely cornerstone to good and well-managed AI. And that to me is a fundamental part of our future. And that when I think about managing and governing our services, really it's to make Copilot shine.
So you took my Copilot question, because that's what I wanted to ask you was how do you see this kind of evolving with that? So I'm going to take it another direction. We're going to go backwards. Is there a particular innovation or thing that happened, and we'll just call it in the SharePoint environment or the group permission management, that kind of thing, that you see as like, oh yeah, when we did that back in X, that really kind of changed the game of how we're approaching this or made things easier? Like, is there something that stands out?
Well, I think I'd pick on a couple of key things. I think one, our group membership management for VP groups, the fact that now the engaged community for some organizations automatically created, constructed an Entra where we sort of right people, that's cornerstone. Us getting labeling even tied to the Entra Microsoft 365 groups, again, cornerstone. The fact that I can differentiate that highly confidential data from that general data. Those are things that make a big difference in an IT organization.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm good. So I was reminded today, what was the first thing I said to you when I first met you many, many moons ago?
Do you like baseball? Never forget it.
Yeah. And what's cool about it, I know we've told that story a few times, right? We do this show, it's real, and that's a real story that really happened. But so what I was reminded about it was just like, it's been a lifelong dream of mine to go to Arizona in the month of March to catch some spring training. And I always figured I'd have to spend my own money on it and things like that. Well, I actually have a work project that's going to send me out to Arizona. I'm going to get to catch a game on a Sunday while I'm out there. So, fly out there a little bit early and check one more thing off the bucket list before I kick it.
That's the pro move, right? Whenever you get to travel for work, try and bookend it with something to do in the city. And I say that as a pro move because I never do that. I'm like in and out, like hotel, or I'm like airport, hotel, client, hotel, airport, and I'm out. That's pretty much how I do it.
Yeah.
But you're doing it right.
The more you travel, the more you fall into that trap. But I've been, since COVID, not traveling nearly as much as pre-COVID. But I'm fully going to take advantage of this trip to Arizona in March.
And you're a big baseball guy, so that's spring training. So you're going to see what teams out there?
I think I'm going to go, and so there's like half the MLB plays out there. And I'm not a big fan of either of these teams, A's and Giants. But from everything I read, which is mostly on Reddit, the San Francisco Giants. Yeah, it has to be true. The San Francisco Giants Stadium in is it Surprise, Arizona, is like, you've got to see it. It's the best. So if you have one to do, that's the place to go. Apparently, at least I'll know if I enjoy it or not. I don't know if I'll be able to say how it ranks against other parks. I've been to a lot of spring training in Florida because I live near Florida, and it's a short drive, short as in 8 hours or so. But
it's not a short drive, but I get it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. I'm sure you'll have a good time. And, baseball's your jam. I'm not much of a baseball fan. And, for whatever reason, our total opposites seem to work on this.
Yeah, exactly. But, mostly where I'm doing my travel these days is for conferences. So we lined up a bunch of discount codes. You want to kind of go over those? Yeah,
we've got 3. So we'll start with the Gartner IAM Summit in London. That one is in March 24th and 25th. And if you use the code IDAC425, you will save, I don't think we ever determined it, 425 of some sort of local currency. I don't know if it's pounds or euros.
I think it's euros.
425 something. I think it's euros though. And we'll have that link in our show notes as well with, discount codes. But yeah, that's kind of cool that they've extended out there. You and I were at the Gartner conference in December, and that was a lot of fun. So shout out to Rebecca for hosting us on stage and giving us the grilling that we gave them a couple years ago.
Yeah, it was she turned the tables on us.
Yeah, how the tables turn. So next up, we've got Berlin. This is something you and I are going to. It's the European Identity and Cloud Conference. That's May 6th through the 9th. And if you use the code IDAC25MKO, you get 25% off of that one. So you and I have been spending a lot of time getting that coordinated and starting to figure out our plans for that. I still have to book my flight, but I do have a hotel, so that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I'm going to go out there the week before. I'm going to be in Oslo, Norway, and hoping to set up an Identivier. Well, that's already being planned. And I'm going to spend the weekend in Copenhagen. So if there are listeners in Copenhagen, would love to meet, even just for a coffee or whatever. Not sure how big our listener base is in Copenhagen, but then after that, heading to Berlin. So
we're worldwide, man. We got listeners everywhere. So
we do. And
if you offer,
I don't know if they'd actually
Jim will buy
meet
you a
with me,
beer
though.
or a coffee or something like that.
Absolutely, glad to.
Let's see. Then after that, we're coming back to the United States, and we're going to do Identiverse 2025 in Las Vegas. So June 3rd to the 6th. Have a discount for that as well. IDV25-IDAC25. They get you 25% off. So you and I have some things that we're planning, and we had a meeting this morning about that. So some fun stuff that we're not quite ready to announce, but stay tuned for information on that. So I'm excited because we're going to do something that we had a good time with last year.
Absolutely. I would expect for, both Berlin as well as Identiverse, we're going to put out as much content as we can coming out of those. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I will. We'll see what happens timing wise, because I would rather not be editing on vacation, stuff like that. So we might space it out a little bit, but yeah, we'll have content for that. And then let's see what else. We got the Authenticate conference by FIDO Alliance. That's coming up later this year. And I think their call for speakers is open, right? Does that run through the next couple of months through March?
Right. Well, actually, no, not a couple of months. The proposal is due on March 3rd. So by the time
about a month.
episode drops, you got a couple of weeks. But, focus on passwordless authentication, device or possession-based factors over knowledge factors. So if you've got a good paper in mind or a good twist on it, something you've done within your organization, they're always looking for things like that. So you go to authenticatecon.com, like Authenticate Conference, but just con.
I will have all these links in the show notes, and they're always on our homepage too, idacpodcast.com. You'll see all the current discounts that we're aware of. So go there, check it out, use the codes, abuse them, send as many people out. And if you do, let us know. Come out and meet us. Jim and I are usually carrying stickers, and we're happy to hand those out. So, all right, why don't we get to our guest who's been patiently waiting in the wings here, listening to this. His name is David Johnson. He's the principal PM architect at Microsoft. Welcome to Identity at the Center, David.
Thank you. Hello. And yes, I'm in the Microsoft Digital organization, specifically at Microsoft, what you might think of as Microsoft's IT organization.
Gotcha. So we're going to get into probably a few different things around like groups and AD and Entra and SharePoint and Teams and all kinds of stuff like that. But it's your first time on the show, so we always like to find out origin stories. Yours might be a little interesting because you've been with Microsoft for like 25 years. So I'm curious, how did you get into the identity space? Is it something that you chose? Did it choose you? Like, how did that come about?
Well, I guess more than 20 years ago or so, I kind of got involved with SharePoint and how we were managing SharePoint on premise. And when you think about some of the key themes around SharePoint, it's about permission management and how are you kind of making sure the right people have access to what, how you doing ongoing access, how do you make sure you're minimizing oversharing of information, the right people should have access to the right stuff. Identity is the center of all that, right? And that's kind of where you think about that from an on-prem world. Moving into the cloud, Entra becomes your foundational story of how SharePoint and how Teams and all these other services are all foundationally managed and tied to identity in Entra. And so really, when I think about how do I govern the Microsoft 365 data estate, which is what I do, I have to govern effectively the Entra data estate, especially when it comes to groups, especially. And so though my focus is Microsoft 365 and related services like the Power Platform and Copilot agents and so on, Entra is a big part of that because it's foundational. You can't be successful if you don't have a good identity stack.
I like what you said there, Identity Center. Somebody should start a podcast called that. Microsoft also has a bunch of conferences. Do you ever speak at any of the conferences that Microsoft does? Because it seems like they have 3 or 4 per year.
Yeah, I do. Last year I spoke at the Microsoft 365 conference. I'm doing again this May. I think it's in Vegas, if I recall correctly, the Microsoft 365 conference. I generally talk about how Microsoft manages Microsoft, how we govern ourselves, because obviously some people are kind of interested in, we're a large customer of ourselves. What does it mean we're managing SharePoint and Teams and Entra groups, and how do we pull it all together to let our employees be successful without IT getting in the way too much?
What's a common question that you get from people when you present and stuff like that? And I have to imagine a lot of people are like, okay, well, how does Microsoft do it? Microsoft using their own products, but is there like a common question that you typically will get after you present?
Yeah, I think it's everything from, there's a lot. It's like, well, do you really turn this all on? Do you really run it? How do you run this at scale? What kind of problems do you have? And it's often coming up with the same concerns customers have. I mean, of us, it's like, how do you deal with the oversharing problem? How do you still sprawl on the enterprise? What are employees allowed to do in your enterprise? How do you just deal with change? You're running in a cloud. How do you keep up with the product stack? As Microsoft, you're kind of your first customer yourselves. Is that hard? Like, those are the common questions that I'll get all the time. And those are common themes that I'll get into, is how do we govern Microsoft and how do we manage effectively all this stuff that people create? And because our guiding principle goes back to, we're trying to let employees do things.
So the conversation we're going to have today is really kind of focused more on your viewpoint as that practitioner, right? We're not talking like Microsoft's tablets coming from on high and saying, thou shalt do this. This is really more your own experience, and just want to get that out there, right? We make sure that we don't portray things the way they shouldn't be.
No, exactly. And I'll say my role is responsible for whatever standard, what do we do internally? And so all I can talk about is how Microsoft manages Microsoft. I can't give, of course, how you should do it as a customer. That's up to you. I'll simply say, I think this is a good idea. This is clearly something we do, but that's as far as I'll go.
So, David, I know as we've kind of gotten into some of the conversations, I mean, clearly, Active Directory and groups way better than I do. So let's kind of ease people into some of these topics that we're going to talk about today. And what I wanted to talk about is how the Microsoft directory products handle entitlements, namely groups. My origin into Microsoft as well was kind of back in the day of Windows NT 4, and there were just groups back then, but there's different kinds of groups now, right? And so I was wondering if you could kind of start us with an overview of what are the types of groups, thinking about kind of the Entra environments and also hybrid environments where you've got, obviously, I think almost all Microsoft customers at this point have got some stake at Entra, but a lot of companies still have that on-premise Active Directory, and they're keeping the two in sync. So if you could kind of give us an overview of how, what different types of groups are out there and how they work.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I'll focus a lot of the Entra groups, the Azure Active Directory as it was formerly known groups. Obviously, things like security groups and distribution lists and email-enabled security groups, security-enabled distribution lists. Like, those are all things that existed on-premise in the AD world. And in Cloud AD Entra, you now have additionally, you have Microsoft 365 groups. And in addition to security groups, in addition to DLs. And the Microsoft 365 group construct is effectively, what's unique about it is, in addition to it being a membership construct to make sure you got the right people, it's also the construct that backs every SharePoint sites and every Microsoft team, for example, channel, are all backed by a Microsoft 365 group. Some people might think of them as universal groups, groups that they have every Viva Engaged community. They're all backed by the same group type in Entra. And that's why when you think about the themes that how do you manage SharePoint? How do you manage teams? At the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to how do you manage groups? Because that's your construct.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what you're doing all the time. And it's kind of like eat your own dog food kind of model. And I don't want to ask you what are the best practices from a Microsoft perspective, but in your mind, when it comes to managing groups, what are some best practices that, you would give that advice to your best friend?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, determine who's allowed to create groups. Obviously, as an IT organization, you have certain trust issues. Everyone does. For example, in our case, we will let our full-time employees create groups. We will let our full-time employees create SharePoint sites and team sites and teams and things like that, but not Viva engaged communities. Sorry, I'm not sure if there's other background noise coming through, but anyhow, point is, we will let our employees create these things. And so it's part one, who can create. Part two, and I think it's really important, I will let people create more groups, more sites, more teams. It's better doing that than, say, letting sprawl happen, letting reuse happen of all these things all over again. I want to make sure that you don't go deep on something. Like, it's far better for you to have multiple SharePoint sites, multiple groups, than effectively doing a bunch of nesting and a bunch of reuse of an existing group for a different purpose. Because at the end of the day, when oversharing happens is when people get it wrong, because somebody didn't realize that this group, this location has a different permission structure than you think. This location has nesting that you didn't realize you just opened this thing up to. And so when you think about kind of groups and of a Microsoft 365 group model, having an ability for people to create things, I think, is essential. But at the same time, that comes with accountability. So we let people create things, but we're also going to validate that we have the appropriate owners on these things, that we've got expiry policies on these things. We keep them only as long as we need to. And that keeps the house clean, because that's the other part of this, that you don't just want groups sitting around forever unmanaged. Oh, and one other big theme for groups is we allow guests in our groups. And it's kind of funny to think about, but it's better from a tenant standpoint, at least for us, to bring guests in and have those confidential conversations and collaboration on our tenant using identities that they're guests into our tenant versus the data would be going away and people leaving our services completely. So we'll bring guests into our services. But one other thing that I talk about a lot about groups is we label our groups. Something that's not necessarily an identity construct, but it is a core, I guess, data construct is how do you manage labeling of things? How do you make sure that the right sensitivity? In other words, something's highly confidential, or is it wide open to the entire company? And so that way I can define and say this Microsoft 365 group is a highly confidential group. Maybe it's an internal only group, and therefore it has policies tied to it. This other group is actually general. It can be all company for all I care. You can bring guests into it. It's okay. But one of the big things that I think about from a best practice standpoint is all the things are on group creation and management lifecycle, but also data delineation. The fact that I have a label on a group means I can delineate the groups which are meant to be open and protect versus the ones that need to be deeply protected because they're backing sensitive data.
Yeah, I see a lot of my clients that I work with over the years have struggled with this concept of how do you manage the creation of groups, and one, kind of making sure that they are putting good descriptions and good metadata, assigning owners, assigning sensitivity, writing the description that makes sense to people, and then not making the process too inefficient, right? But usually there's got to be some kind of like check or approval process. I think what I've seen probably the most is some kind of process where either third-party tools in use or there's a lot of PowerShell scripting that takes place after a review has been done of like a request for groups. But I guess initially when you said, hey, it's delegated, any employee can create groups. I was wondering what are the mechanics of that you'd have that kind of quality check?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because an employee can create a group in the Entra portal. They can create a group in Teams. You go in Outlook, go create a new group from Outlook. Go create a new group in SharePoint because I want a new SharePoint site that's a team site that's backed by a group. So all those experiences do a group creation flow, and all those experiences, basically, they all honor the rules. Like we get to define in Entra who is allowed to create. We get to define the naming rule policies for groups. We also get to define, like we could put prefixing if we were to choose to, obviously, effectively the naughty word list as we think about it, the words that you just shouldn't put in a group name, things like that are in the block word list, things like that. Plus the label definition that Entra will, if you have it all configured, will force collect the label of a group. So it doesn't matter where you create it, it's creating SharePoint or Teams or Entra, it'll collect the label of a group. And from there, the group is created. And then we will do checks after fact. So the in-product provisioning, we're actually letting people, directly in Outlook, right? We're not having a third-party tool or some custom UI to create the group. Co-create the group where you are. We believe that it's actually faster for our employees. It's more intuitive for employees that create in the in-place experiences, but we're going to hold them accountable to what they created. We're going to force them into the naming rules, of course. We're going to force them into the labeling, and we're going to react after fact. So we have a bunch of things running against a tenant in a reactive way to watch what's done. So of course, there's all the proactive stuff around collecting the basics, which the product is going to do, and all the reactive validation to go, hey, you didn't add a second owner to this group. We're going to require you to add a second owner to this group, for example, or the second owner's left the company. We're going to catch that and force you to add a second owner, things like that.
How do you enforce those types of controls with that? Is it a form-based thing where it's doing like data validation? Is there some tool or maybe PowerScript or something running behind the screen, or PowerShell running behind the screen? How does that work?
So that's a great question. I think first that Entra will collect what you tell it to collect, just at least in terms of the labeling and naming rules and stuff like that. Other things are literally Azure jobs running against a tenant that scan for anomalies, catch them, send a notification to the group owner to say thou shalt take action, basically. And if you don't take action in a certain amount of time, we do delete things. Like one of the things that the nice thing about 365 groups and Teams and SharePoint, all these things, these constructs are restorable within 30 days. So as IT, I don't feel too guilty about deleting it. So if you don't take action as a group owner, I'm going to hold you accountable. If you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to delete the thing. I give you plenty of warning, but then I've got that Azure job, which is going to run against a service and wipe your group out.
Hey, David, one thing that you touched on, and I don't want to let it go, was about nesting. And so I know a lot of my clients that are in kind of hybrid environments have got nested groups, and it seems to be the bane of their existence at some level. I'm wondering kind of what is your perspective on group nesting?
So I'll frame it. There's two really good stories here. Part one is Microsoft 365 groups actually don't even support nesting, at least not today. That's actually a really good thing for me. So I don't even have a nesting thing to worry about on a Microsoft 365 group. So part one. But there's a catch because people like nesting. People like their DLs where they've got some VP distribution list made up of a whole bunch of a directs distribution lists, and they want to bring it all together, or security groups or whatever. What we do for that is we use either dynamic groups in Entra, or we have our own group membership management tool, which is actually on GitHub, and we can share the link, that people can actually use. It's just an open source tool effectively of how do you do group membership management, then build automatically populate. So that VP group, they don't have to worry about it. So I don't have to have a bunch of nested groups in that VP group. If I really want to add group one into group two and a bunch of other things and miss people based on some business rule, for example, all full-time employees under some vice president or all program managers under this team, we can totally do that. Our tool will run and build the group membership out and keep it up to date. I don't need nesting at that point. And that to me is the best practice is don't use nesting. If a membership needs to be managed from some tight way with some business rules like that, and or you want to delegate it down to bring in a whole bunch of other things, use membership management in some way to build your group out. Don't just try to build some nesting hierarchy that people are likely to get wrong. And quite frankly, we see them getting it wrong. Back to your point on security groups, yes, they get it wrong. We don't realize that this group is embedded with a whole bunch of other groups.
I want to go back to something you mentioned about inviting guests into the environment. I feel like this is something that a lot of people maybe don't understand, or maybe isn't configured, on their own tenants to kind of do it the way that they are expecting it to. But first of all, let's not lose anybody. What do you define as a guest when it comes to Entra or Microsoft or SharePoint, I should say.
Right. So how I kind of think about that is obviously tenant members, we mint the identity. So we, Joe at Microsoft.com, minted identity, or even a supplier where we're minting the identity, v-joe at Microsoft.com, right? Those are things on our tenant members. Guests are where we invite, Joe at Contoso.com is a guest into our project that, someone wants to bring Joe at Contoso into a team, or they want to share a file on SharePoint to Joe Contoso. They'll bring them into a tenant as a guest, and therefore do a sharing. And so the guest effectively is anyone whose identity isn't minted in your tenant. You're not owning the identity construct. You're simply saying, I trust Contoso is validating it, that the identity is coming from them. I'm forcing some rule, like in our case, our guest model is set up to say, we're going to require multi-factor authentication that the other provider better have it set up. Otherwise, we're not going to trust that guest. But assuming they do, and Entra will confirm that, then the guest can come into our tenant, assuming, of course, the employee has invited the guest. And then, of course, you got Lifecycle, but I'll get to that in a minute. So the basic construct is anyone who's outside of our tenant boundary from an identity perspective, we consider them guests.
And that guest can be a Microsoft account, or can it be a Google account or an email address? Like, what's the requirement there?
So it can be any work identity from any other organization, effectively anything Entra supports from a guest perspective. So yes, typically work identities. You can have consumer identities as well, like in a Microsoft account, to your point. You can have social identities, depending. We're focused predominantly on work identities that we bring in as guests from Entra, or Microsoft account identities as guests in Entra. As long as we can do a validation to say, yes, you really are who you say they are, then we're okay.
What is something that people commonly get wrong when they're setting this up? Because I feel like I've had so many different experiences coming in as a guest to other environments that I'm not sure if there's a right way or a wrong way to do it.
Well, I think part one, where people can get this wrong, is what are you allowing a guest to do, and what are the guest defaults? Like, I think the big theme that scares companies to bringing in guests is kind of a construct of, well, what does this look like? What are we going to get access to? Which is why your environment has to be configured to basically block guests by default. It has to be a very purposeful act to bring a guest in. So even a guest is in your tenant in some way in the directory structure, doesn't mean they have access to anything. That guest has to be explicitly added to something to get access to it. I can bring Joe at Contoso.com into that tenant as a guest, but until I bring them into a team or invite them to access a file, they're not going to get anything. Right. And so that's a cornerstone. And the other thing, when I think about guest management, I mentioned labeling earlier, but that team is going to be default, for example, or that 365 group is going to be default guest blocked. Like we say, our default group label is confidential Microsoft internal only, which means just that, no guests. You have to switch the label to allow a guest to become a member of a group. And then even then, you're going to have invited that guest, bring them in. And if there's any files, those files are going to have to allow guests. So everything we're doing is guest blocked by default, but guests allowed based on data label and sensitivity management. So those are the other big themes. And the other part that I'd say from a tenant perspective is lifecycle management for guests. And that's for us a really big thing. How long should that guest be there? Like, we will wipe guests from our directory if they're inactive for a period of time. I think it's 60 days right now. And we'll force a reattestation of a guest that when you invite a guest into a team, you'll have to reattest to the fact that the guest should still be there, half a year later, roughly. Should the guest still have access to this thing, the SharePoint, this file, this group, right? We require reattestation all over the place.
You had a couple questions that I was going to ask about that lifecycle part of how long is too long to have a guest who's not doing anything within your environment.
Yeah, I'd argue if a guest is inactive in your tenant for 60 days, they should be in your tenant, right? There's got to be a reason they're there. That partnership has to be an ongoing thing, and someone has to care, right? Someone who invited that guest in needs to care that the guest is still there. Otherwise, why are they there? I think my point is, it's totally legit to have a sensitive project, even cross-tenant, bringing the guests into a project. I'd rather it be on my tenant. But as soon as that project is done, I want it out. And if a project manager forgets to get them out, I'm going to get them out.
Oh, they'll never forget. No one ever forgets to remove.
No one ever
review.
forgets. No, exactly. Access reviews and Entra are so essential. I think they're an undervalued thing that really critical. SharePoint also has access reviews. You bring a guest into a SharePoint site or shareable file, same thing. Access reviews kick off.
One of the things that I think people try to take advantage of is delegated authority and having an admin in an organization kind of manage their own. Does that really apply to the guest environment? Is that more for, let's say your own tenant minted identities? Where does the role of a delegate managing a separate organization come into this?
Well, I mean, to a degree, you are. I mean, if you're using what's considered native identity or, the native, I forget what B2B Direct Connect. That's the other Entra kind of guest construct. Then you're basically setting up a trust relationship with another tenant. Or if you're doing multi-tenant organization, you're setting up a trust relationship with another tenant. And then you're basically delegating to say, yep, I have a deeper level of trust with this other directory, right? Otherwise, for guest, you're defining on Entra what basic levels you're going to level the trust. You can say what domains, for example, you're going to allow in by default, what domains you're going to block, what people are allowed to bring in, and what authentication type you're going to allow, right? Or you can go all the way in to say, yep, we're going to require conditional access checks, for example, and you must have passed your conditional access checks for your organization, right? Those are all things that you can do that help you be in better shape. And that's back to your delegated identity, sorry.
No, that's good advice. Let me take this from the angle of what should I not be doing when it comes to that sort of delegation? Are there like things like, ooh, you're really probably not going to have a good experience with that, or it's not secure, or guidance like that?
Well, I'd say be thoughtful again about who can bring in. Do you trust your employees? Are they trained sufficiently? Make sure that, again, you have a good data delineation story around where guests can access. Because to me, inviting somebody into your house doesn't mean you want them to raid your fridge, right? So make sure you got a very clear view of they're allowed in the living room, but not the kitchen kind of deal. And making sure that's set up in advance and making sure you got a clear plan for that in advance. Bringing guests in without any plan is a problem, right? You don't know what they're going to get, right? And, Microsoft's made mistakes ourselves too. Like, this is not like saying, yeah, we're perfect. We mess up. And we keep learning and getting better about all this. So guest management for us, it has become a critical thing. We absolutely manage our tenants in a very aggressive way, knowing those principles. Allow guests in, employees are allowed to invite, we will get rid of them, we will make sure our data is properly delineated so they only have access to the right things.
I want to keep talking about SharePoint, but I want to kind of clarify when it comes to SharePoint Online, are we also talking about Teams? What is the overlap there, and how is it different from an access management standpoint?
It's an interesting topic because every team with the channel hierarchy is a Microsoft 365 group. That's how it's backed identity-wise. And so the membership in the team is actually membership in an Entra. That's how it's defined. That team also comes with a SharePoint site. So when you create that team, you create that Microsoft 365 group, you get a SharePoint site for it, which has all the advantages now of saying, I have a membership aligned to that site, aligned to that team. I have one membership for everything. And it's kind of the one membership rule them all construct because it's so valuable, right? I've got a project team, and it doesn't matter if I'm in Planner or SharePoint or Outlook or Teams. I've got the membership construct behind it, and they can work in all those workloads, and they're just against the same Microsoft 365 group behind the scenes. It's pulling it all together, right? That's the beauty of this stuff, that team, it has that SharePoint site. In fact, Teams, when you think about it, is its whole storage layer for files is SharePoint, right? For any real team. So it all fits together intrinsically.
I kind of feel like philosophically, the team / SharePoint is an umbrella that you can hand over to somebody and say, you decide what files go in here, what goes in under the umbrella, and then you can manage the permissions within the umbrella, like who gets access to what. But you're not going to be able to break out of that umbrella to manage the permissions beyond that. So it's kind of a safety zone. Right. But I feel like that is an uncomfortable situation sometimes for, people who own identity and access management, in that, like, it seems to me like it's just the area that you hand over to somebody else. Do you kind of feel like, I guess that's the way the product's designed, but in your experience, are you worried about kind of what they do under their umbrella, or is that arm's length?
Yes. No. Oh, yes. And I think there's some strategies for that. Everything from based on type of site. You have this deep secret site, highly confidential, as we call it. Maybe the owner doesn't allow any sharing of the site. There's SharePoint settings say only the owner of the site, the owner of a group, can share anything on it. No breakaway permissions, no sharing. Everything's completely tied to the membership of a group, which is tightly controlled, right? So you do that as an example. You can block downloads. You can rights protect content on that site. So you can absolutely lock down SharePoint, and to the access management be entirely controlled and limited to the Entra group. In fact, with new kind of user-defined permissions in SharePoint type that is entitlement backed by a rights protection envelope effectively, you can literally allow downloading of encrypted content that if someone loses access to the 365 group and SharePoint site, they'll lose access to the downloaded content too. They won't be even decrypted anymore. We kind of go that far. And so we can do a ton of protection so that I can choose to say yes, but because this is a tented project, the owner controls everything effectively. And by the way, I have a very much of trust but verify model in that we let people create things, as I noted, but we'll not only make you attest to things, we'll make you label things, we also will double check to make sure you got it right. So everything from purview DLP to scan for patterns of, hey, we found a password on this site in a file somewhere, we're going to flag it, we're going to do something about it. We run oversharing reports, including what's now in SharePoint Advanced Management, to say, you shared this confidential site with half a company. That's not allowed. And we flag that, and those reports can look for that kind of thing, so we can then take action. So I'd say there are times that you're going to have a hard, aggressive lockdown model, and there are times that you're going to do a trust but verify model to say, I'm going to let people do things, but within some boundary, and then I'm going to verify that they got it right. And if I got it wrong, I'm going to take action.
David, I feel like when we all talk about our 20 plus years in whatever, we kind of date ourselves. Yeah. I'm going to give you a blast from the past right here. So do you remember a product called Moss, M-O-S-S, which was essentially SharePoint? You could build websites with it. Mm-hmm. I don't think Moss is around anymore. What is there a replacement? What's the deal?
Well, SharePoint lets you build what's considered portals, communication sites. And so, in fact, within Microsoft, our internal portals are all on SharePoint, as an example. The construct of having a SharePoint platform provide external sites doesn't exist right now. But internal sites, absolutely, right? So people, as opposed to using some other platform, will normally be using SharePoint as their web hosting for some communication site, like our HR portal, for example, and corporate portals. They're all, and tech web, as we call it, they're all on SharePoint. And so, but they're different type of SharePoint. So when you think about SharePoint from a collaboration and teams perspective, that's kind of type one. Then you think of this other type of communication sites where you're building a portal for, providing information to your company. That's kind of the other big type that we absolutely still use. But what you might think of as Moss is a kind of a communications front end, is now everything from Viva, includes everything now from Viva Amplify and Viva Communications to, of course, core communication sites in SharePoint.
So I mentioned early on that you've been with Microsoft for 25 years. So speaking of age and aging ourselves, I want to shift maybe a little more to the future here. What are some of the things that you see changing when it comes to this topic, either Entra, group permissions, SharePoint sites? Like what is, and I'm not going to hold you like you're not the product person, right? These are not promises, but how do you see this evolving over time?
Well, I think, there's two themes. And I think one, helping our employees get it right becomes one of the big themes, right? And whether you think of it as AI or you think of it as good intelligence against a service, watching what employees are doing, helping steer employees into the right behavior, helping make sure you're detecting and almost fixing when something has gone wrong. That's kind of, to me, where I see a lot of this going. The constructs of, when I say labeling, and we're kind of going labeling everywhere, that so more and more content and things are getting labeled. Like we label a meeting, for example, and that meeting label will then define, potentially what the files for that meeting should be that come out of that meeting. If you have a meeting recording, it should be as sensitive as a meeting itself. The identity management, again, be limited based on label of what's allowed, so that highly confidential thing will have rights protection tied to it, for example. And so these things all fit together to me to be, and again, to your point earlier, identity is absolutely the center for all of this. But I think that's a big part. The other thing for me is, of course, as Microsoft Digital, Copilot is one of our big things that we're working with and trying to enable. And as we envision where we're going with Copilot, you think of like data management and data hygiene and protection. That's kind of cornerstone. AI is fantastic, but if you have bad or overexposed information, AI is going to surface it. AI is not going to care that it shouldn't show you something. You have access to it. It's going to show it to you. So getting permissions right, getting the memberships right, getting identities right is absolutely cornerstone to good and well-managed AI. And that to me is a fundamental part of our future. And that when I think about managing and governing our services, really it's to make Copilot shine.
So you took my Copilot question, because that's what I wanted to ask you was how do you see this kind of evolving with that? So I'm going to take it another direction. We're going to go backwards. Is there a particular innovation or thing that happened, and we'll just call it in the SharePoint environment or the group permission management, that kind of thing, that you see as like, oh yeah, when we did that back in X, that really kind of changed the game of how we're approaching this or made things easier? Like, is there something that stands out?
Well, I think I'd pick on a couple of key things. I think one, our group membership management for VP groups, the fact that now the engaged community for some organizations automatically created, constructed in Entra, we sort of right people, that's cornerstone. Us getting labeling even tied to the Entra Microsoft 365 groups, again, cornerstone. The fact that I can differentiate that highly confidential data from that general data. Those are things that make a big difference in an IT organization. That we have 700,000 SharePoint sites, as an example. You think of a volume, how do you know? That's why labeling, and I get hung up on that kind of conversation. People think I talk about labeling a lot, because otherwise, how does IT know when something's overshared? IT has no way of differentiating that massively shared file from some one site from another, unless you have delineation labeling in place to tell you, by the way, this is highly confidential, that oversharing is probably wrong versus not. And I think getting that kind of theme right was essential. As we kind of gone on this journey with SharePoint, that's allowed us to do better trapping of when employees get it wrong and kind of steer them in. So to me, those are kind of cornerstones of things that I think about are really critical.
David, I'm going to take you back even further.
Okay.
So this is kind of a fun one. So I met Steve Ballmer that's over a decade ago. Of course, I remember that he's like a giant, right? He's a very large human being, which I think you don't realize until you meet him in person. But he's also a very nice man. So I think sometimes people don't think about that when they think of him, but like that's what I was reminded of, is just like he was a gentle giant, if you will. I've never met Bill Gates. I've never met Paul Allen. I love the pictures of them, like when they first started the company, because Paul's got that big grizzly beard and Bill's kind of like this younger, like lean kind of guy. But I'm wondering, have you ever met any of those three?
I've met Bill in passing, but not like never had any presentation. Same thing with Ballmer. I've been in meetings with Ballmer and Satya. So I mean, these things are it's great to be in those conversations. It's great to watch them in action. Because like not only is Ballmer and now Satya and incredibly I think almost to your point, gentle giants, but kind and wise. But I'd also say wise and smart about asking the right questions. And that's what you want in your leaders, right? Is the right questions you get asked, right? Challenge assumptions. Ballmer did that, and now Satya does that in spades. Like the questions and continue to learn and self-improve. That's a cornerstone of our culture, right? As Microsoft, and I think we've evolved over time to get that. Our CEOs over the years have been continuing to build that cultural improvement, which I'm excited about, and I've watched it happen. I've watched the company go from a very and sometimes difficult culture at times where you have potentially conflicting situations to where it is much more of a one Microsoft kind of challenge assumptions and make the company better, do growth mindset kind of mentality, essentially would call it, right? So yeah, I love where we are, and our leaders have I think, back to your point, grown and it's just amazing this history we've had and how we've changed so much as a company over the years.
Been an interesting ride for sure. So I'm happy you're able to spend some time with us. I know for us it's a Friday late afternoon for you. Yep. We want to get the weekend started. Before we let you go, what do you do for fun outside of this? I think you mentioned you have some travel. Maybe you're going to Hawaii.
Yeah. I know. I'm a big travel fan. I love to travel. Tropical places in particular. So, if you put me on a beach, I'll happily follow a turtle kind of deal. Go snorkeling, follow a turtle, go diving, go explore a little bit, right? Those kind of things, but that's my happy place, right? So, when I'm in the Seattle Redmond area, it's like, it's cold. It's, not nice now. When I travel, yeah, I'm happy.
Is there a particular place that you like to go the best? Like, what's your favorite spot to go to?
I'm still a Maui fan, kind of Maui. That's my home base basically when I'm in the islands. But anything tropical with beautiful sand, that's nice water. That's my place, right? So almost anywhere. I mean, I've been to many places like that. I've been to Tahiti and lots of great tropical destinations. But for me, Hawaii and Maui is my still home base, right?
All right. So you're a veteran. I've never been to Hawaii. Give me a pro tip that I can use to say, okay, this is not some newbie coming over from the mainland.
I think be open, be kind for Maui. I mean, Maui, the people, the place, respect for the environment, it's really cornerstone. You come in as a tourist, you're not going to get, it's not as quite as, you want to be, I guess I should say, not come in as a tourist, but come in as someone who wants to embrace the area and embrace the culture, embrace the beauty, and not running to go to the mall, not running to go to some restaurant, right? Just enjoy the time, enjoy the people, enjoy the culture, right? That's to me the Hawaiian thing, right? The spirit of aloha is real.
Jimmy, have you ever been to Hawaii?
I have, and I've been to Maui, and I love Maui. And I've only been there once, but my pro tip would be, and this is outside of all the tips that everybody will give you, you got to be on island time. If you go there and you're like, all right, chop, gotta, we're going to get breakfast and we're going to drive all the way around the island, then we're going to do X, Y, and Z, you're probably not going to be happy there. You'll still be happy there, but you might make everybody else miserable. Go there, be on island time, and then, the tips that everybody will give you, you got to try the banana bread. So there's this, you can drive all the way around Maui and you feel like you're in different places at different parts of the island because of the amount of rain that they get and stuff like that. And there's also a big thing, which I've not done, but when I get back, I want to do, which is you can get on a bike and go around this volcano. And basically, you don't have to pedal because the car drives you to the top, and then you just ride the bike down the volcano and let gravity do the work. But you can rent a Jeep or something like that, drive all the way around the island. And there are people who live on these little plantations, and they just, I don't know if you would call it survival farming or whatever, but they basically just live there and they do the farming, and then they make the banana bread and sell it on the roadside. And it's just super cool. If you haven't been there, you definitely should put it on your list.
Oh no, banana bread. Yes.
I'll say you're getting a head nod from David. So definitely you're hitting that chord there.
Yep. And you're right on the island time thing. Absolutely. Just chill. That's what I mean. Follow a turtle. Respectfully, of course.
Yeah, respectfully. That sounds like something I can get behind. When I go on vacation, I don't typically like to have an itinerary. It's kind of like, all right, we'll just kind of do whatever today. So island time sounds like the perfect spot for me. So, all right, okay. We're going to let you go, David.
Okay,
we appreciate you spending some time with us. We're going to wrap things up for this week. Let's see what else. I'm going to have your LinkedIn in our show notes, if that's all right. People have questions about things or whatever it may be, feel free to reach out. And then I hope you'll come back and share some more tips and tricks from the wizard himself at some point in the future. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. You can find us on the web, idacpodcast.com. If you like what you heard, hit that like and subscribe button, whether you're on YouTube or whatever podcast. If you don't like it, hit like anyway, and then send it to a friend and trick them into listening to it. We don't care. As long as people are listening or watching, that works for us. And connect with us on LinkedIn if you have questions, comments, ideas for shows, things like that. Jim and I read all that stuff, and we try to take that under advisement for future episodes. So thanks, everybody, for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.